In the summer of 1901, a survey launch moved along the northern shoreline of Isle Royale, cutting through water that geologist Frank Leverett described in his field notes as unusually clear for the season. Leverett worked under contract with the United States Geological Survey, tracing the faint beach lines that ring Lake Superior, the terraces left behind by a lake that once stood at a different level entirely. The launch moved slowly past low cliffs and scattered spruce, the kind of coastline a survey crew could cover in an afternoon without incident. Near the entrance to McCargoe Cove, several feet below the current waterline, he found a shelf of stone that did not match the shoreline around it. It ran level for some distance, broken by what looked, from the boat, like a deliberate cut in the rock. Leverett sketched its rough position and moved on to finish his assigned section of coast, because his task was glacial geology, not archaeology, and the shelf did not belong to the survey he had been sent to complete. More than a century would pass before anyone asked the question his notes never answered. Isle Royale's copper pits, thousands of them, dug by hand into solid rock long before any European vessel reached the Great Lakes, sit today above the modern waterline. The lake the ancient miners knew stood somewhere else, and if the shoreline moved, whatever the miners built along it, a landing, a dock, a harbour, may have moved with it, into the water and out of the record. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The pits themselves are not folklore. They are catalogued, measured and radiocarbon dated, cut into rock that required fire, hammerstones and years of patient labour to break open. Archaeologists working the Keweenaw Peninsula and the island across the open water from it have identified several thousand individual mining pits, some no larger than a shallow basin, others deep enough to reach a grown man's shoulder. The people who dug them worked the purest native copper deposit in the world, metal close enough to workable purity that it needed no smelting, and they worked it for a span radiocarbon dating now places at roughly 5,000 years, beginning long before the pyramids at Giza and continuing for centuries afterward. That much is settled. What has never been settled is where all of the copper went. Estimates of the total volume removed from the pits run into the millions of pounds, and the finished copper objects recovered from sites across the eastern half of North America, the beads, the awls, the ceremonial blades, fall well short of accounting for that volume. Somewhere between the pit and the artifact, a great deal of copper disappears from the record. One explanation has nothing to do with lost fleets or vanished peoples. It has to do with water. Lake Superior's shoreline at the time the pits were active did not sit where it sits now. The land beneath the entire Great Lakes basin has been rising unevenly since the glaciers that once covered it retreated, a process geologists call isostatic rebound, and the northern shore of Lake Superior has risen faster than the southern shore, tilting the basin the way a dish tips when lifted unevenly at one edge. That tilt has drowned some shorelines and exposed others, slowly enough that no single generation noticed the change, only the record left behind by comparing one century's shoreline to another's. Long before Leverett noticed the shelf near McCargoe Cove, the miners had already shaped a coastline of their own. Archaeologists group this culture under the label Old Copper Complex, a term covering scattered communities across the upper Great Lakes who mined, cold-worked, and traded native copper across roughly 2,000 years of the late Archaic period. Native copper at this purity can be shaped without a furnace. Annealed by heat and worked with a hammerstone, it can be beaten into a blade or a fishhook, reheated, and reshaped again without losing strength. That property alone explains why the metal traveled. Copper points and beads made from Lake Superior ore have turned up in burial sites hundreds of miles south, carried along river systems and portage routes that predate any written record of trade on this continent. This is documented in the archaeological literature, most thoroughly in the research of the archaeologist Susan Martin, whose book on the subject corrected decades of inflated 19th century tonnage estimates and reset the scale of old copper complex mining to figures the archaeological record can actually support. Martin's corrections narrowed the gap between extracted copper and recovered artifacts. They did not close it. Even at her more conservative estimates, the volume removed from the pits still outweighs the volume accounted for in known finished objects. The scale of that exchange is documented under what archaeologists call the Hopewell interaction sphere, a term used to describe the network connecting communities across a large part of eastern North America during the Middle Woodland period, roughly 2,000 years ago. Lake Superior copper moved through this network alongside Gulf Coast marine shell, Rocky Mountain obsidian, and Appalachian mica, turning up in burial contexts as far from the Great Lakes as central Ohio. The existence of the network is not in dispute. What has always been harder to pin down is the mechanism at the Lake Superior end of it, the point where raw copper stopped being a mined resource on an island and became cargo moving toward the mainland. Radiocarbon dates from old copper complex sites away from the mining pits themselves help anchor the chronology at both ends. Burials at sites such as the Oconto site in Wisconsin have returned dates placing worked copper tools solidly within the late Archaic period, broadly consistent with the multi-millennial span calculated for the mining pits on Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula. The dates do not, by themselves, say anything about transport or harbors. They simply confirm that the mining and the exchange network described under the Hopewell interaction sphere overlap enough in time that a stable transport mechanism, used across many generations rather than a single expedition, remains the most economical explanation for how the copper reached burial sites hundreds of miles away. Frank Leverett understood none of this when he sketched the Anomaly in 1901. His concern was glacial history, and the report he produced with his colleague Frank Taylor, published by the United States Geological Survey in 1915 under the title The Pleistocene of Indiana and Michigan and the History of the Great Lakes, remains a foundational document in North American glacial geology. It traces the sequence of ancient lake stages that preceded the modern Great Lakes, Lake Algonquin, Lake Minong, Lake Houghton, each a different configuration of shoreline, water level, and outlet before settling into the lakes recognized today. Leverett and Taylor establish, in exhaustive detail, that Lake Superior's shoreline has not stayed fixed for the last several thousand years. It has moved repeatedly, by measurable amounts, at different rates depending on distance from the center of glacial rebound. Their report does not connect that movement to the copper mining already underway while the shoreline shifted, because no one asked it to. The miners who worked Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula for 2,000 years lived through a lake that was actively changing shape around them. Any landing point they built at the water's edge during that period would have been built for a lake that no longer holds that shape. Where the shoreline dropped, such a structure could sit exposed above the modern lake. Where it rose, the same structure could now sit beneath it, depending entirely on which stretch of coast it occupied. This is where geology and archaeology overlap in a way neither field was built to resolve on its own. Geologists map shorelines, archaeologists excavate pits. Almost no one has asked what a 2,000-year mining culture would have needed at the water's edge to move the copper it extracted, and almost no one has checked whether the answer to that question now sits under several feet of Lake Superior. The copper had to leave the island somehow. Isle Royale sits roughly 15 miles from the nearest mainland shore at its closest point, across open water that modern boats still treat with caution. A mining operation lasting 2,000 years, producing enough worked copper to reach burial sites 500 miles away, required organized transport, and organized transport requires a place to load and unload, a harbor in the broadest sense, whether a sheltered cove with a built landing or simply a stretch of shoreline used consistently across generations. That absence says more about where research attention has gone than about what the water actually holds, and the geology places any such evidence beneath the modern waterline rather than above it. On the mainland shore nearest Isle Royale, the historic portage route, later named Grand Portage by French traders, channeled travel between Lake Superior and the interior river systems for centuries before European contact, a route so well established that fur trade companies simply adopted it wholesale in the 18th century rather than finding a faster alternative. A portage of that durability does not appear from nothing. It reflects a travel corridor already worn into regular use long before anyone wrote it down, which is consistent with though not proof of, a mining culture on Isle Royale, needing a reliable mainland landing point directly across the water from it. The Leverett and Taylor chronology places the Nipissing stage of ancient Lake Superior, the stage overlapping the height of old copper complex activity, at an elevation several feet above the present lake in some parts of the basin and, because of the same isostatic tilt, below present lake level in others, depending on distance from the tilt axis. McCargoe Cove sits close enough to that axis that a shoreline feature built during the Nipissing stage would, by Leverett and Taylor's own elevation figures, now sit at or just below the modern waterline. That is a narrow, testable claim. It requires no lost civilization, only that Leverett and Taylor's published elevation data be checked directly against the depth of the shelf they sketched, a calculation that, as far as the published record shows, has never been carried out in the century since the monograph appeared. Michigan's own state geological survey, led for years by Alfred C. Lane, produced a parallel body of work mapping the copper-bearing rock formations of the Keweenaw Peninsula in exhaustive technical detail. Lane's reports, published in the early 1900s, focus on ore geology rather than shoreline chronology, and they do not reference Leverett and Taylor's federal survey at all. A reminder that even within Michigan's own geological establishment, the state survey studying the copper rock and the federal survey studying the ancient shoreline around it operated as separate projects with separate audiences. A level shelf cut into an otherwise uneven shoreline is not, by itself, proof of construction. Wave action and ice scour produce flat surfaces on their own, and any claim that the McCargoe Cove shelf is artificial would require a controlled underwater excavation that has never been conducted at that location. What can be said is that the shelf sits at a depth consistent with where the ancient shoreline would have stood during the height of old copper complex mining, based on the chronology Leverett and Taylor themselves established. The depth matches the timeline. Whether the shape matches human construction remains an open question rather than a settled one. What is settled, and what makes the question worth asking, is that submerged prehistoric structures exist in the Great Lakes and have been found before. In 2009, a research team from the University of Michigan, led by archaeologist John O'Shea, used sonar survey and diver investigation to document a network of stone structures on the Alpena-Amberley Ridge, a land bridge that once crossed Lake Huron before rising water submerged it roughly 9,000 years ago. The structures, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, are caribou drive lanes, low stone walls built to funnel migrating caribou toward waiting hunters, sitting today under more than 100 feet of water. The find rested on sonar imaging, later confirmed by divers who touched the stone alignments directly and mapped their pattern against known caribou hunting techniques used by other Arctic and subarctic peoples, evidence considerably more solid than newspaper testimony or family memory. Before O'Shea's survey, no one seriously proposed that Lake Huron's floor held evidence of organized ancient hunting. The lake bed was assumed to be exactly what it looked like from the surface, open water over featureless sediment. It was not. Lake Superior has never received a comparable survey. Isle Royale National Park's own underwater archaeology program, run with the National Park Service Submerged Resources Center, has documented an extensive record of 19th and 20th century shipwrecks in the surrounding waters, work that is thorough within its own mandate. That mandate has never included a search for pre-contact shoreline features tied to the copper mining period. Shipwrecks get surveyed because they fit an established methodology, with a name and a sinking date to confirm against. A 5,000-year-old shoreline feature offers no name and no date, and it has simply never been looked for using the tools that found the caribou lanes in Lake Huron. The technology to search for it already exists. Side-scan sonar and diver survey, the same tools used at the Alpena-Amberley Ridge, are already in regular use on Lake Superior for shipwreck work. What has never happened is someone making the formal case for pointing those tools at the stretch of coastline near McCargoe Cove to whoever holds the budget to authorize it. Michigan Technological University, headquartered in Houghton at the heart of the historic copper country, operates a Great Lakes research center with active programs in underwater archaeology and remote sensing. The center has surveyed shipwrecks throughout Lake Superior and collaborated with the National Park Service on portions of the Isle Royale shipwreck inventory. Its published project list does not include a survey of pre-contact shoreline features tied to the old copper complex, which means the closest available combination of expertise and equipment sits less than 100 miles from McCargoe Cove, without ever having been directed at the question this shelf raises. The cove itself has an industrial history of its own, and separating that history from anything older is part of the difficulty. In the 1870s, the Meenong Mining Company operated a shaft and stamp mill directly on McCargoe Cove, extracting copper from the same rock the ancient miners had worked centuries earlier and shipping it out through the same stretch of water any ancient harbor would have used. The company's operations, chronicled in period Michigan mining reports, ran for only a few years before the vein proved less productive than investors had hoped, and the site was abandoned by the end of the decade. Whatever 19th century construction the Meenong Mining Company left at the cove, docks, cribbing, loading structures would sit far closer to the modern waterline than anything from the old copper complex period, and separating the two is part of what any future underwater survey of the cove would need to account for before drawing conclusions about anything older. The copper that left Isle Royale had to cross open water to reach any mainland trade route, and the most efficient crossing points, based on distance and prevailing current, cluster around a small number of coves on the island's northern and eastern shore, McCargoe Cove among them. A harbour built to support 2,000 years of mining activity would very likely sit in one of these same coves, which is also where the shoreline has shifted most according to the Leverett and Taylor chronology. The two facts point at the same handful of locations for entirely independent reasons, one geological and one logistical, and that alignment is the strongest evidence currently available that a submerged old copper complex harbour is worth looking for, even though it has not yet been found. None of this requires abandoning the archaeological consensus that the old copper complex was the work of late Archaic period indigenous communities, a conclusion supported by radiocarbon dating, tool typology, and continuity with later Great Lakes copper working traditions. Who mined the copper has already been answered, where they loaded it for the crossing, and whether that answer currently sits under water that has never been searched with the technology that found the Alpena-Amberley Ridge has not. Underwater archaeology in the Great Lakes is expensive, weather-dependent, and shaped almost entirely by funding priorities set through park mandates and academic grant cycles, neither of which has ever prioritized a 5,000-year-old shoreline over a 19th century shipwreck with a known name and a documented cargo manifest. The absence of a search reflects where institutional attention has been directed for the last century, far more than it reflects the actual contents of the lakebed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The place to start looking for that direction is not the 20th century, it is the 1860s, when the Quincy Mining Company and the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company began large-scale industrial copper extraction across the same ground the ancient miners had worked centuries earlier. 19th century crews regularly broke into ancient pits while sinking their own shafts, and later archaeological summaries, including Susan Martin's, document that these encounters were treated as obstacles to clear rather than sites to record. Ancient pits were blasted through, backfilled, or mined straight past, and whatever tools, wooden shoring, or organic material had survived inside them from the Archaic period was destroyed without documentation in the overwhelming majority of cases. A small number of finds did make it into the record, including large worked copper masses recovered from ancient pits and later crated and shipped east to museums and private collectors, sometimes with only a rough note of which company's land they had come from, and no controlled excavation record at all. Some of these masses weighed well over a ton apiece, requiring teams of horses and specially built sledges just to move them out of the pits before they could be shipped anywhere at all. The masses themselves survive today in a handful of collections. The context they were removed from does not. At the same time this destruction was underway on the ground, a different argument unfolded in print. 19th-century writers, faced with mining pits, burial mounds, and other prehistoric earthworks across the eastern half of the continent, frequently attributed them to a vanished people distinct from the indigenous nations living in the region, a claim that served the political convenience of the period by separating the continent's most impressive ancient works from the ancestors of the people the United States government was actively displacing. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology, under the anthropologist Cyrus Thomas, spent the better part of a decade dismantling that claim. Thomas's 1894 report to the Bureau, based on excavation of hundreds of mound sites, concluded the mound-building cultures were the direct ancestors of documented indigenous nations, not a separate vanished people. Within its own field, it was a genuine correction, closing off a comfortable and inaccurate narrative in favor of a harder, more accurate one. The correction addressed mounds specifically and said little about the Lake Superior copper mines. The institutional habit the mound builder claim revealed, treating impressive prehistoric works as somehow separate from ordinary indigenous life, rather than as evidence of sustained, organized, generational labor, took decades longer to fully unwind around the copper mines. Even after the mining culture was correctly identified as late Archaic period indigenous work, its logistics, how the copper actually moved off the island, how a landing or harbor might have functioned, received comparatively little sustained attention. Logistics do not produce the kind of artifact that draws research funding the way a burial mound or a distinctive tool type does. A shoreline is not a museum piece. It sits underwater, unglamorous and difficult to search, and for more than a century, no institution with the resources to search it has had a strong enough reason to try. What remains, in the absence of that search, is the same handful of clues Leverett left behind in 1901, a sketch, a depth, and a shape that does not quite match the rest of the shoreline around it. Leverett did not think of himself as a witness to anything beyond glacial retreat. His field notes from the surveys conducted between 1895 and 1905, later folded into the 1915 monograph with Taylor, describe dozens of shoreline anomalies across the Great Lakes basin, most of which turned out, on closer inspection by later geologists, to be exactly what they appeared: old beach ridges, wave-cut terraces, glacial till reshaped by ice. The McCargoe Cove shelf is one of a small number of anomalies Leverett flagged without fully explaining, a habit common enough in careful field geology, where an investigator notes what does not fit the expected pattern and leaves it for a future survey, rather than forcing an explanation the evidence does not yet support. That future survey never came, at least not one aimed at the shelf itself. The 1915 monograph became, and remains, a standard reference in Great Lakes glacial geology, cited regularly by geologists studying lake stage chronology and isostatic rebound. In the century since its publication, it has never been cited by an archaeologist studying the old copper complex, because the two fields simply did not read each other's literature. Geologists tracking ancient shorelines had no reason to cross-reference archaeological reports on mining pits, and archaeologists excavating those pits had no reason to consult a geological monograph about beach terraces. The information sat, correctly filed and accurately published, invisible to the one discipline that might have connected it to the missing copper. Leverett and Taylor's report has been public since 1915, available in any research library with a Great Lakes geology collection. The gap here is structural, the ordinary kind that opens whenever accurate evidence gets filed correctly within one discipline and never crosses into the discipline that would know what to do with it. The closest the record comes to a human account of the site, rather than a purely geological one, sits in oral history collected from Isle Royale's 20th century commercial fishing families, several of whom worked the waters around McCargoe Cove for generations. In interviews conducted decades later by park historians documenting the island's fishing era, some of these families described submerged rock formations near the cove that boat operators learned to steer around at certain water levels. Those interviews were conducted to preserve the history of the fishing industry before the last of the families passed the trade down, and the submerged formations appear in them only as a practical hazard, a thing to avoid, not a thing to investigate. No one asked the fishing families whether the formation looked built. No one collecting their history was looking for that answer. What survives, then, is not one dramatic testimony, but three separate fragments, each accurate within its own narrow purpose. A geologist's sketch from 1901, a published monograph from 1915 that cites the sketch without archaeological context, and a set of 20th century fishing interviews that mention the same stretch of water without geological or archaeological context at all. The three fragments were never assembled into a single argument until recently, and even now the assembly remains circumstantial, a pattern rather than a proof. Isle Royale National Park receives roughly 20,000 visitors a year, a modest number compared to mainland parks, kept low by an island reachable only by ferry or seaplane and closed through the winter months. The ancient pits appear on some interpretive trail maps, described to visitors in general terms as evidence of prehistoric copper mining, without reference to the unresolved question of how the copper left the island. McCargoe Cove remains a working anchorage for park visitors and researchers, its water clear enough, on calm days, to see well below the surface near shore. Visitors who walk the Minong Ridge Trail near the cove today pass within a short distance of both mining histories at once, the 19th century shaft house foundations left by the Minong Mining Company, and, somewhere beneath the water a short walk further, whatever remains of the shoreline the old copper complex miners once used. Neither site carries a marker distinguishing one period from the other for the ordinary hiker, and the water itself carries no marker at all. The shelf Leverett sketched in 1901 has not been formally relocated by any modern survey, though its approximate position remains recoverable from his original field notes, held in the archives that preserve early United States Geological Survey material. No excavation permit has been filed for the site, no sonar survey has targeted it specifically. It remains exactly what it was in 1901, a noted anomaly in a glacial geology report, waiting for a discipline that has not yet arrived to ask what it actually is. The broader mystery of the missing copper, the gap between what the pits produced and what the archaeological record accounts for, remains open in the same way. Susan Martin's corrected estimates narrowed the gap considerably from the inflated 19th century figures, but no single explanation, trade dispersal, ceremonial deposition, or losses across the crossing to the mainland, currently accounts for the full volume on its own. A submerged harbour would not resolve the mystery by itself, and it would not explain where every pound of copper went. What it would do, if the McCargoe Cove shelf or a comparable feature elsewhere along the old shoreline turns out to be built rather than natural, is confirm that the ancient mining operation had an organized point of departure, built specifically for moving copper off the island at a scale the pits alone do not fully explain. Michigan Technological University's Great Lakes Research Center, mentioned earlier, would be the most logistically obvious institution to run such a survey, given its existing equipment and its proximity to the site, if a formal proposal were ever put forward. That would matter. It would mean the old copper complex included maritime infrastructure organized enough to leave a trace after 5,000 years of a shoreline rising and falling around it. Until someone points a side-scan sonar at the water near McCargoe Cove using the methodology that found the Alpena-Amberley Ridge caribou lanes under Lake Huron, the question stays exactly where Frank Leverett left it in 1901, recorded, filed, and unexplained. Frank Leverett's notes eventually went to the same federal archive where thousands of other early geological survey field books are stored, catalogued alongside surveys of shorelines that turned out to hold nothing more than ordinary glacial till. His sketch of the McCargoe Cove shelf sits among them, unremarkable on the page, a small pencil drawing of a rock ledge that a working geologist noticed for a few minutes on an otherwise routine afternoon in 1901, before moving on to finish his assigned section of coast. It survived because it was filed correctly, in the ordinary bureaucratic way that keeps most government archives intact, one folder at a time, regardless of what any individual folder eventually turns out to hold. Isle Royale keeps its copper pits visible above the waterline for visitors to walk past on marked trails, hand-dug depressions in rock that anyone can see and touch. It keeps whatever else it holds below the waterline, in water cold enough and clear enough, on the right day to let a boat operator glimpse the outline of a shelf that still does not quite match the shoreline around it, exactly as it has for more than a century, exactly as it did the day Frank Leverett first noticed it and moved on. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.